Hello and welcome to part 2 of our unit on Reconstruction in Virginia. In part 1, we focused on the struggles of all Virginians, the economy, and the difficulties that were unique to newly freed African Americans. We also talked about 2 programs that were designed to help former slaves meet their basic needs. Today, our focus is going to be entirely on how white people across the South and in Virginia actively work to reverse policies meant to help African Americans and how this would lead to another 100 years of oppression and inequality for people of color. Our goal for this lesson is to be able to answer yes to the following statements. I can define segregation and discrimination. I can describe the effect that Jim Crow laws had on African Americans and American Indians. In the years immediately following the Civil War, there was so much hope for African Americans across the country. The 13th Amendment was passed, which abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment made anyone who was born or naturalized in the United States a citizen, including Black people. This directly overturned the Dred Scott decision we learned about in the last unit. Then, with the addition of the 15th Amendment, Black men were afforded the right to vote. In addition to these amendments to the U.S. Constitution, federal troops were sent to former Confederate states to enforce these new laws and to ensure Black people had access to all necessities equally. During the Reconstruction years, 16 African American men were elected as representatives for federal and state governments. While these laws didn't end racism, it looked as if everything was going to work out, and African Americans would finally see equality after more than 200 years of slavery. Unfortunately, after President Lincoln was assassinated, his successor was much more lenient on the South. He was, after all, from the South, and he sympathized with them. Under his presidency, federal troops were removed from Southern states to appease them. Funding was also removed from necessary programs like the Freedmen's Bureau. As soon as these were no longer in place, Southern whites began to work to take as many rights as they could away from African Americans and other people of color. In the years after Reconstruction, the United States saw a huge backslide on progress, and it would be nearly 100 years before we began to work our way back towards equality. But we'll get to that in our next unit. As a result of over 200 years of slavery, during which time Black people were seen as property and white people were raised to believe that they were naturally better, white people still held racist beliefs even after the end of slavery. To this day, there are still those who hold racist beliefs, but it has become socially unacceptable, and we don't see it as much. In the years after Reconstruction, though, the majority of white people still held the belief that they were superior and that people of other races didn't deserve to be treated the same as them. This belief in Black inferiority led to the poor treatment of African Americans. Treating someone differently based on the color of their skin or any other attribute that is out of their control is called discrimination. Throughout this video, you will learn about many ways that white people discriminated against Black people and how lawmakers made it legal to discriminate based on race. One of the first ways that Southern states began to take away rights from African Americans and other people of color was with Black codes. These were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and to make sure they were still available to work as a cheap labor source. Some of these laws, including requiring Black people to sign year-long work contracts and only being allowed to hold the job of farmer or servant unless they paid an annual tax up to $100. Laws like this basically required Black people to maintain the same role and status as when they were slaves and allowed white farmers to pay very little for their work. As a result of the racism that was widespread across the South, governments began enacting laws that required Black people to use separate facilities from white people. White people wouldn't even use the same water fountain as a Black person. This separation of people based only on race is called segregation. Over time, these laws became known as Jim Crow laws. Their purpose was to ensure that Black people were not seen as equals in public spaces such as schools, restaurants, movie theaters, parks, bathrooms, and more. and the facilities provided to Black people were frequently run down and inadequate compared to those provided to white people. A prime example of this was in the country's public school system. Under the law, all children had to be provided access to public education. This is how former slaves should have been able to build their lives. However, under segregation, children of different races went to different schools. White children largely attended schools that were well staffed and supplied with all necessary materials. On the other hand, children of color were sent to schools that were run down. Without enough teachers, the classrooms were overcrowded, and they definitely didn't have updated textbooks. Imagine yourself in a school that I just described. Would you want to be there? Do you think you would learn well in that environment? Probably not. And that was one of the biggest challenges people of color faced in trying to improve their lives. If they couldn't receive the same quality education that white people received, how would they ever be on the same playing field? Even as segregation spread across the country, there were a few activists who never stopped working toward equality for all Americans. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery in Franklin County, Virginia. He was raised to believe that education was the key to success, and eventually he walked 500 miles to get to Hampton, Virginia, to study at the Hampton Institute. That school is now the historically Black college, Hampton University. After his time there, he became a teacher, a writer, and a speaker. He pushed his fellow African Americans to work hard regardless of how they were seen by white people and to earn their money and find their own success. He is probably best known for his role in founding the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama so that other African Americans could have the same educational opportunities that he had. Another Black man who fought for equal rights was John Mercer Langston. He was born in Louisa County, Virginia, to a white father and former slave mother who was part Black and part Indian. After his parents' deaths, Langston moved to Ohio, where he would later work for the Freedmen's Bureau. While there, he raised money to build schools for African Americans and fought to uphold the voting rights of Black men. Some of Langston's greatest accomplishments were becoming president of the new Black college, Virginia State University, and being elected to represent Virginia in Congress. Before we get to the next person who worked to fight against racism and unfair laws, we need to talk about how it was determined who those laws applied to. In 1924, the Virginia General Assembly passed the Racial Integrity Act. Under this law, there were two groups, white people and everyone else, called people of color. It introduced the one-drop rule of racial identity. No matter how little African ancestry people had, they were colored, not white. Colored people in Virginia included African Americans, people of Asian ancestry, and Virginia Indians. Under this new law, Indians were told they were no longer Indians, but many still held tight to their ways and identities in private. While this law applied only in Virginia, other southern states had similar laws. That brings us to the third person we need to recognize, Homer Plessy. Plessy was born in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1863, 2 years before the end of the Civil War. He was born to a mixed-race family, largely of French and Creole descent, and they were considered free people of color, although Homer considered himself to be 7/8 white and 1/8 Black. He could easily pass as a white man. This no longer mattered with the one-drop rule, and he didn't want to abandon other African Americans who were not white passing. So he volunteered to be a test case for the new Jim Crow laws. On June 7, 1892, Plessy purchased a first-class ticket for the East Louisiana Railway and boarded the white-only car. He did this fully expecting to be dragged off, arrested, or both. And that's exactly what happened. He was arrested, and the New Orleans civil rights group he was working with posted his bail and hired a white attorney to take his case all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that Jim Crow laws were violating his 13th and 14th Amendment rights. Ultimately, only one justice sided in his favor, calling the Constitution colorblind. but the majority of the court ruled that separate but equal laws were constitutional because African Americans were provided with equal facilities as white people. Separate facilities weren't the only or even the largest obstacle faced by Black people during this time period. The biggest threat to African Americans' freedom was the push to stop them from having a say in government. With the 15th Amendment, all male citizens were given the right to vote, including African Americans. This was very important because our country's democracy is built on the participation of its citizens. For the people, by the people, just like the Constitution says. Everyone should have a say in who represents them and how the country is run. After all, these elected representatives would be the ones to write any new laws and get rid of old ones. One of the ways that states prevented Black people from participating in the government was by implementing poll taxes that they couldn't afford and literacy tests that didn't make any sense and were nearly impossible to pass. Some states even created grandfather clauses, which said that if your grandfather was a slave, then you couldn't vote. Without the ability to vote, white men who wanted to further push out Black people continued to be elected, and the cycle continued. All right, you've reached the end of part 2 of our Reconstruction unit. We are leaving off on a not so great note, but we will get back to this idea of segregation and discrimination in our next unit. For right now, take a moment to ask yourselves the following questions. Can you define discrimination? Can you define segregation? And how did Jim Crow laws affect people of color?